Okay, good evening, everyone. Really appreciate everyone coming out, and really wanted to give a, big thank you to Rabbi Levitt and to your congregation for welcoming us in this past Shabbat, as well as this evening as we're having this presentation. Sometimes mental health issues are things that people are a little bit uncomfortable talking about, and really being courageous enough to bring those things up and to talk about them is so important, because for many people, the fact that it's hard to talk about these things is something which makes coping with them, managing them, and getting the help that one needs and support one needs much more difficult than it needs to be. And our mental health is something which can be quite challenging. And without support and without feeling comfortable being able to engage with others about it, it can be that much more challenging. So it's really great that there are a few congregations as well as other organizations that are really opening up to the idea of bringing these discussions to the fore. And that's really what our organization, Refuat HaNefesh, is all about, is trying to encourage people within the Jewish community to feel more comfortable talking about these complex and private and difficult issues in an open way, so that we can really help individuals address them and work towards achieving wellness. I think that we're all aware of the fact that at this time in history, when we're facing so much in terms of the effects of COVID and the pandemic on society and the disruption in our lives, as well as the fact that it's just a really tense and complicated time for other reasons as well. Obviously with the election coming up in a couple weeks, people's minds are on big, complicated issues, and many people are experiencing, sometimes for the first time, that they're having difficulty coping with and managing some of their thoughts and feelings that become intense and overwhelming. And because of that, at Refuat HaNefesh, we really felt it was important at this time to reach out to communities and try and offer an opportunity to talk about ways in which people could address those things and ways in which they could get help. So I'm going to introduce to you now Dr. Mintz, who was already introduced, so I won't go back into the specifics, who's really a tremendous expert in these areas with an amazing amount of clinical experience, and somebody who, as the chairman of our board and a founder of our organization, really cares so much about going way above and beyond what he does professionally to give back within the Jewish community at large, to help people achieve mental wellness. So we're really glad that you had us. And as Rabbi Levitt mentioned at the end, I'll talk briefly about some of the programs that we have that can really be supportive of individuals. But for now, I'll turn you over to Dr. Mintz.
Thank you so much for both of the introductions, and it's really a pleasure to be here. I appreciate you all inviting me into your congregation. I was going to start with a COVID joke, but I was worried you guys might not get it for a couple of weeks. All right, silly joke. Thank you, Rabbi Levitt, for smiling. Rabbi Levitt and I agreed that we're going to do this question-answer style to keep it a little more interesting. So Rabbi Levitt will throw some questions at me, and I encourage you as well, if you have questions that pop up, put them in the chat, and I'll try to answer as much as I could.
Okay. So I have experience also giving jokes saying jokes in front of people and hoping for some response, right? So I could have used that from the pulpit if you hadn't already used it now. What has been just to begin with a big picture question, what has been the impact of the pandemic on mental health, mental illness generally?
Sure. So it's been really interesting. When this all first started, we expected to get a major influx of our OCD patients with extra stress about hand washing, people that had anxiety, and we really didn't see it. We actually saw quite the opposite. The patients that were already established with us, for the most part, they were actually doing fairly well. And part of it, I think, was for the first time maybe in their life, they felt very validated. They've always maybe been a little bit stressed. They've been anxious about the world that they live in. And now all of a sudden, the entire world was anxious. And so they felt that, people understood what they were going through. And they also, a lot of people with mental illness had been in therapy for years and had learned a lot of coping techniques. And so to a large degree, the patients we expected to see get worse were actually doing better than the general population. On the other hand, we have seen a big spike of people coming in that weren't previously diagnosed with mental illness. We know, according to the WHO, the World Health Organization, only about 17% of people have what they call optimal mental health, where they have real good resiliency and they put the factors in place to help them function ideally. And so when COVID hit, it really put a stress on everybody. And so we saw a lot of people come in that previously had no disorders, but were really struggling. There was an interesting study that came out of Wuhan a couple months into this crisis before it even hit the US. And they looked at a large sample of people in the city to see how many people felt anxious, what people's distress levels were. And what they found was something really interesting. They found that everyone's levels were increased. People were more anxious, people were more distressed, people were not functioning as well as they had before the pandemic. But when they dug down into the data, what they found is that when they surveyed frontline workers, the nurses, the doctors, the respiratory therapists, the people that were treating people with COVID, the people that we would have thought would have been doing the worst, they were actually doing the best. The people that were doing the worst were the people that maybe weren't working at that point, or were working from home, were sitting on their couch watching a lot of news. They had the highest levels of anxiety. And the person who wrote this paper theorized that maybe what was happening was those people had no locus of control. They were sitting on the couch watching the news and everything was going crazy around them. The world was in complete disorder and they weren't able to do anything about it. And that may be what caused such high anxiety. The frontline workers, albeit they were in a more dangerous situation, they may have felt like they had more control over it as they were working on coming up with new treatments and trying to save the people that were very sick. So it's really been a little bit of a mixed bag. Some people are certainly doing worse. Some people maybe are stable or doing a little bit better. But overall, the numbers of people with stress and people presenting for mental health treatment has definitely increased.
So I can definitely relate to that feeling of watching the news over the last 8 months, especially in March and April, but even now, and feeling sort of more stress there and anxiety and maybe even depression at times than I would normally have. I think that's something many of us probably can relate to. How do we know when that rises to a level when we should seek professional support? And who do we turn to? There's sort of a number of different mental health professionals that one hears about. Where do you start?
Sure, good question. So first off, I would say that if you're having difficulty functioning, if you're not able to continue working at your job because of your mental health symptoms, if you're not able to give your spouse support, if things that you previously were doing very well in your life, if now you're really struggling with them, and whether you notice it, whether a spouse, a loved one, a friend notices it, if somebody thinks that you could use some help, as a mental health professional, I have maybe a little bit less stigma, but I think go in and see somebody. I think there's no harm. You could definitely start with a therapist. Someone will do therapy with you, whether a social worker, psychologist. And in the long term, that may provide you more skills to get through some of these acute anxiety type periods. Once you're getting to the more moderate or severe stages, where you're really not able to function, then I would recommend seeing a psychiatrist to discuss the possibility of medications. Most people, though, with what's going on now, are able to get by with short-term therapy or maybe some short-term medications, and then they're able to return to a regular level of functioning once they get that help. There's 4 areas that I typically examine when I'm trying to determine if somebody needs that extra level of care. And those are the physical symptoms, the cognitive symptoms, the emotional symptoms, and the behavioral symptoms. And I'll break those down for you. So when I talk about physical symptoms, I'm thinking about increased muscle tension. So your shoulders are hurting, your jaw's hurting, you're getting a headache, maybe you're getting more stomach aches. Maybe you have changes in appetite or your eating habits. Or maybe you're very jumpy, you get startled easily. Sleep is a big indicator that something might not be right. So if previously you slept well and now you're having trouble falling or staying asleep, that might indicate something's wrong. And then we have decreased energy and fatigue in terms of the physical symptoms. So any of those alone is not a major worry you may not have to get help, but if a lot of those are happening to you, it's time to maybe start thinking about seeing somebody. Then we move on to the cognitive symptoms, how you're thinking. So a lot of times when people are struggling, their concentration and their memory is no longer as good. So someone might have to repeat something to them many times because they're unable to concentrate when the person's speaking with them. Work might be getting more difficult. Just having a regular conversation might be more difficult. And then inability to make decisions. Oftentimes, if people are getting increasing symptoms of depression, anxiety, they're not able to make decisions as easily as they were previously. The third category is the emotional symptoms. So if you're experiencing constant worries or sadness, if you have an increased sense of anger, guilt, hopelessness, if you feel emotional numbness or you're not enjoying things that you previously enjoyed, or if you're feeling disconnected from friends and colleagues, those would all be in the emotional category of things that might raise a red flag for you. And then finally, there's the behavioral category. So if you're having frequent crying or outbursts, if you've increased use of alcohol, drugs, gambling, or you're engaging in other risky behaviors, or if you have this desire to be alone all the time and you don't want to spend time with people, those are all indicators that something might not be right and it might be worthwhile to seek out a mental health professional. And again, you could start with either, whether it's a therapist or a psychiatrist, but see somebody, and if you need some other type of care, that person will direct you to the right level of care.
Okay, and what about the case of someone who maybe has some symptoms or is struggling with, you know, heightened anxiety and stress, or more sadness, depression than normal, but it doesn't rise to the level of a sort of diagnosable mental illness? What are there coping strategies that you would suggest that we can use in our daily lives to help us during this time?
Sure. So typically the first thing I would recommend is spending time with optimists. However, these days, I think it's important to stay as far away from people that are positive as you can. Another joke. Okay. All right. So really, I've got, we'll say 10 recommendations in this area. So number one, in terms of coping, physical activity is the most important thing that you could do. So getting out there, spending 30 minutes a day, ideally. Cardio is better. If you're in the sun, even better. And just move, whether it's walking, jogging, biking, just something to get your heart rate up and get you moving, get yourself outside of the house, ideally. It's obviously harder as it gets colder, but exercise. If you're inside, there's definitely some great, the Peloton app, YouTube has some great videos, something to motivate you to get you going. Number two, I'd say healthy diet. So you definitely want to make sure you're having 3 meals a day. Even if your appetite's not great, it's important to have 3 meals a day. Green vegetables, vitamin D, especially as it's less sun, omega-3 fatty acids. Get all your vitamins, right? Make sure you're eating a healthy diet. Number three, I'd say, have a regular sleep pattern. Make sure that you're going to sleep and waking up at the same time every day, regardless of how things have changed for you. Even if you don't need to work right now or you're not able to work, try to keep a regular sleep pattern. And it's important to keep the phone and the TV either off or out of your room when you're trying to go to sleep, because those could definitely impair your sleep. Number four, doing things like this, right? Going to social events, going to shul, getting together with people, whether it's in person or virtual, is extremely important. And you really should not let a day go by without speaking to somebody or trying to engage in some activity. If people don't have a lot of connections, they're not able to find people that they can spend time with, meetup.com is something that is an excellent resource. They will connect you with people that have similar hobbies and interests, and it's a great way to meet people that you can spend time with. Next, I'd recommend guided imagery or meditation. So essentially what you're doing is you're imagining that you're in a place that's peaceful or calming to you. It could be a place you've been or a place you'd like to go to. And again, there's many apps, many YouTube channels that will help with this. The next suggestion I'm going to recommend to you for coping is a technique called progressive muscle relaxation. And I could take you through, one of these later if we have time. But essentially, you're putting yourself in a comfortable area and you're choosing a muscle group, whether that's your legs, it's typically either to start with bigger muscle groups, so usually your legs or your arms, and then you tense them, you breathe in, and then as you breathe out, you let them go. And doing that several times a day could release a lot of anxiety and stress. Similarly, you could try something like yoga or Tai Chi, YouTube channels for that too, and apps. Breathing exercises are very helpful, and there's a whole host of different ones out there. Again, same thing. You can find them on YouTube. You can find apps that walk you through them. Some people will find a lot of benefit from journaling. So write down your thoughts, positive, negative, whatever they are. Just writing your thoughts has tremendous therapeutic benefit and allows you often to get out the things that you're holding in. And many times people find that when they write out their thoughts very quickly, there's just this sense of tension that gets released. And then finally, humor, music, art, things that you enjoy, things that are going to take your mind off of what's going on out there. So all of those, and I know I went through them very quickly, and I'm happy to discuss any of them more if people have questions, but all of those are really good coping techniques for people that are struggling, but are not going to see a mental health professional. Any of those have very strong studies behind them that indicate that they alone will improve your mental health. Some of them to a larger degree than even medications will. So very worthwhile to engage in those. And honestly, even if you're not struggling, they help kind of get you ready in case things do come up in your life and make you stronger. So I recommend them for anybody.
And what do you see as being the long-term impact of the stress that we're living under now? How is this going to, in a lot of ways, I think we're all trying to figure out what life will look like post-COVID. What will life look like post the stress of COVID?
Yeah, absolutely. And I wish I knew the answer to that. I don't. I don't think anybody knows. We're all guessing, just like we're trying to figure out what the best treatments for COVID are and how we could vaccinate people safely. We don't know. I mean, time will tell. What I could tell you is that after any general disaster or other pandemics, things that have happened in the past, what we see is maybe up to 15% of people will develop what we call post-traumatic stress disorder or have long-term symptoms related to that stressor. On the flip side, though, about half of the people that go through a traumatic episode will develop what we call post-traumatic growth, where they could point to a positive change that the trauma brought about in their lives. And typically when we talk about post-traumatic growth, we're looking at 5 different areas. So those are increased opportunities that they've had that they wouldn't have had without the trauma, closer relationships, greater belief in the self, appreciation of life, or a greater connection with Hashem or with whoever their God is. So in one of those 5 areas, more than half of people actually will develop some growth. And so could be people will have long-term impacts. The hope is that we'll have more benefit from this, even if it's hard to recognize at this point, than we will have some of the negative symptoms that linger with us. In this past week's Parsha, so after Adam was cursed for eating the forbidden fruit, he's told, "Kotes v'dardor tatzmiach lecha," which typically is translated as "thorns and thistles will sprout in your field." The Chizkuni, though, one of the commentators, he translates it a little differently. He says, "You will cause the thorns and thistles to sprout." And he explains that this isn't a curse that thorns are going to come in your field and you're going to have to pull them out. It's saying that you are going to use thorns and thistles to make yourself a fence to protect your crops from animals and robbers, and that it's going to be a technique you use to protect the hard work that you put in to growing your produce. And, I've always liked this Chizkuni since I learned it, because thorns are definitely something we typically think of as an inconvenience, something that scratches us, rips our clothes, not something we want around. But you can really look at it the other way too, and it could be something that protects you from things that are more dangerous than thorns. And that's something I think we could definitely do with COVID. We could use it to strengthen ourselves and grow from the experience. When we look back, there's a podcast that I like to listen to. It's called How I Built This. It's a Jewish guy Raz with NPR, who does it. And he has been talking about this point, nonstop over the last several months, that with every difficult period, there's more innovation, entrepreneurship, growth. There's so many businesses that wouldn't be out there today if not for struggles in the past. And honestly, we don't even need to look at, different businesses. We could even look at our own history. The Holocaust, I think, most people would agree, are one of the worst experiences that has ever happened in humankind. There's a woman, Dr. Rachel Yehuda, who many of you may know the name. She's from Cleveland Heights, and she dedicated her career to studying trauma and Holocaust survivors. And what she found is that Holocaust survivors that emigrated to Cleveland after World War II, they had greater happiness in their marriage, greater life satisfaction, they had higher incomes and lower criminality rates compared to U.S. Jews who were not victims of the Holocaust. And that story, I think, definitely, or that research really indicates that yes, people that went through the Holocaust, they had tremendous suffering still. Many of them still had nightmares throughout their lives and still do today. There's a lot of negatives, but they were also able to really overcome it and maybe do better in life because of the struggles that they went through. And I have a personal story with this. So um, one of my aunts, recently wrote this story, and she wrote, a Yiddish author in 1941 captured the scene of Jews fleeing Lithuania when the Nazis came. He made fun of a flaming red-haired woman fleeing with her husband because she was not only dressed impeccably, but she also had a pair of elegant high-heeled shoes draped over her shoulder. What did she think, he asked? That she was going to a ball? And so that woman who this Yiddish author talked about, that was my Bubby. And no, she knew she was not going to a ball. She was running away. She was running for her life. But she realized that life would not always be this unbearable. Life would not be this terrible. There would be a life after the Holocaust. And she brought her heels because she wanted to be able to celebrate again. And she exhibited this trait in a similar way. Many years later, she was diagnosed with cancer, and the doctor told her she has 3 to 6 months to live. And she responded to the doctor, "Who made you God? Right? Why do you get to decide how long I live?" And she actually ended up living 10 years and really took full advantage of her life and really enjoyed every moment of it. And so we could see, a lot of these things as things that are going to destroy our lives, things that are going to end our lives. But sometimes even massive roadblocks or disasters can really lead to a brighter future. And one thought I had recently about COVID, just on a global level, who knows? Maybe this is going to lead to a universal vaccine that protects us from a host of diseases that we couldn't prevent before. This is something that's being studied, and it was not on the forefront before all this because we hadn't had a pandemic in 100 years. But now, it's something that's being looked at, and we really don't know. We'll know decades later kind of what the outcome was. And there's definitely terrible things that have happened with COVID. And, when somebody passes away from it, we can't bring them back and we can't change that. But I'm also very hopeful that at the end of the day, there's going to be a lot of benefits, both for our society, as well as for individuals. And I'm hoping that the toll that we experience from it will not be as significant as we might fear.
So before I pose the next question, I just wanted to remind people that if you, I have a few more questions left, but if you have questions, put them in the chat, and then I'll ask Dr. Mintz when I'm done with the questions that I have. So you mentioned that a certain percentage, a fairly high percentage, or 40, 50%, I think you said, of people will develop this post-traumatic growth. That obviously also leads a lot of people who don't develop it. What can we do to make it more likely we'll experience some sort of post-traumatic growth as individuals? And also thinking personally as a rabbi, are there things we can do as shuls, as community organizations, that make it more likely that people who are part of our community will experience this?
Sure, it's a great question. I'll answer them one at a time. So Ben Sherwood, who you may or may not have heard of, he wrote a fascinating book called The Survivors Club. And in the book, he talks about all sorts of disasters that people should not have survived, but did survive. And he talks about kind of physical characteristics or things they knew before that helped them get through the experience and live to talk about it. But he has one chapter in it where he talks about the relationship with belief in God. He himself is Jewish. But so he has a word in it that I think is fantastic. And he says that mazel when we say mazel tov to somebody, typically we think of it as saying to them good luck. But he explains that mazel, mem zayin lamed, stands for makom and zaman, right? A place and a time, which on the surface, just that alone, it means that your luck solely depends on being in the right place and the right time. However, the lamed at the end, he says stands for lasso, what you do. So in every situation, you could choose how to act and respond. Many of us probably know what Viktor Frankl said. Very famously, he said in his book, between stimulus and response, there's a space. And in that space, we can choose, right? So when it comes to COVID, we could let it bring us down, or we can control our response to that situation. So I'm going to give you right now 4 components to post-traumatic growth. And I call it the ABCDs. I actually made this up myself, so you won't find it anywhere else. But we'll go through the A, B, C, and D of how you as an individual and potentially the community as well could achieve post-traumatic growth or make it more likely. So the first one, A, is angle, or how you frame it, how you look at a situation. And so before I go on explaining this, Rabbi Levitt, I'm actually going to ask you a question. So, and I know I didn't prepare you for this. I apologize for putting you on the spot. But when I was probably about 10 years old, my older brother was in the basement with a bunch of his friends on Shabbos, and they were playing this game where they each held these massive balls and ran at each other, each from different ends of the basement. And when they were doing it one time, one of the kids flew up, hit the ceiling, came down, and broke both his arms, both his legs, and his nose. Do you think that he was lucky or unlucky?
Say unlucky.
I think that would probably be the typical response. Most people would probably say unlucky. Most people do not, break all their arms and legs and nose in their life. To do it, in one instance is pretty bad. I want to suggest, though, that maybe he was lucky, right? So yes, he broke a whole lot of things, but if he fell in a different orientation, if he fell on his head, he might have had a brain bleed. He could have definitely injured some organs. Everything he injured was non-vital, right? So yes, you want to be able to walk. Yes, you want to use your arms. They all heal. It's not going to kill you. That is how I think we need to look at this situation, right? So yes, maybe we're unlucky that we've lived during coronavirus. But if we could think about on the flip side, how it could have been worse or what we've gained from it. So that's an angle that will allow us to achieve post-traumatic growth. So as an individual, were you able to maybe work from home? Were you able to see your family more? Did you get to read more books? Were you able to engage in the arts, pick up a hobby you haven't done in a long time? Everyone could find something that maybe was lucky, or either if it could have been worse or what you gained from going through this situation. If you're still having a hard time, so then I'm going to recommend, fake it till you make it. So there was a TED Talk I heard many years ago, and I can't remember who it was that does this research, but they basically talked about how if before a job interview, you go into the bathroom and you look in the mirror and you start, flexing your muscles and you start telling yourself, I'm going to get this job, I'm the best person for this job, and you really talk yourself up, you are more likely to get that job. So when they blind people, half the people will go and tell themselves that things are good, that they're the best person for the job. And then half the people don't do that. The interviewers who don't know which is which group will rate the people higher that went into the bathroom before and talked themselves up. We are very much influenced by what we do, what we say, and subliminal messages out there. There's a great study that showed that if you play French music in a grocery store, people are more likely to buy French wine or to buy cheeses. So we really respond well to things, even when we're not realizing it. So if you don't believe that there's any positive to COVID, smile, do it anyways. I don't know, have some kind bars, wear some Life is Good shirts. Do something that, even if you don't buy into it, will give you that subliminal message that things are okay right now. And that will help you, at least on a subconscious level, frame it in a positive way. So that's the A, the angle. The B is bigger. So if you look at this world and you realize how much bigger this world is than you, how much bigger human history is than you. That has been shown to lead to greater rates of post-traumatic growth. So go outside during the day. It's beautiful outside right now with the fall trees in Ohio. Look at some large trees at night, gaze up into the stars, maybe study some history and think about all the other tragedies that have happened before us, how much history has happened within this, wonderful world that we live in. And, just appreciate how large both this world is, the universe is, and human history. And realize that Gamza Yavor, this too will also pass. And this is just one small blip in the history of humankind. We know that, Hashem created Adam outside of Gan Eden. And we're told that it's because if he was born inside it, he would never appreciate how amazing it was. Sometimes we have to move out of our comfort zone, of the things that we benefit from, in order to appreciate it. Right? So every season must end. I mentioned the trees before. If we only had autumn, we would not appreciate how beautiful the trees are. So Hashem creates season. Hashem makes it so that we go from one season to another, so that each time it comes around again, we appreciate it. So with these challenges, when they happen, so they could give us an appreciation for all the blessings we have in our lives, all the things that have gone right up until now. And even if you think back in your own life, look at all the obstacles you had to overcome, whether it's, educational obstacles with your job, with your family. Think about the altruistic goals that you've reached. Think about how far you've come and realize that it's just so much bigger than this one moment that you're living in now. That's the B, bigger. Then we move on to the third one, which is connections, or C for connections. And so we spoke about this before with a coping strategy, but also extremely important for forming post-traumatic growth. So the research is very clear that those who connect with others during a tragedy have much less distress and a greater chance for growth afterwards. When there's a mass tragedy, people typically do a lot better than when there's an individual tragedy, because they have so many more people that they could cope with, that they could talk to about it, that understand what they're going through. The rush on, Parshat Bereshit, he points out, as many commentators do, that at the end of the second day, it does not say Kitov. Every day but the second day says Kitov. And he says that the reason is because on the second day, Hashem created the firmament that separates the upper waters and the lower waters. And anytime there's any separation, that's not good. We know also when Adam and Chava, when Chava was made and they were put together, right? Lo tov liot Adam levato. It's not good for persons to be alone. We're meant to be together. The Chizkuna gives an alternate pshat, an alternate explanation, and says that it doesn't say Kitov because on the second day, Gehenna, or hell, was created. And I honestly think they go together. When people are separated, they're more likely to encounter hell, both metaphorically and really literally. And so we need to stick together to get through the difficult time and to grow from them. And so really the connections you make, the connections you have, are one of the most important things you could do. And really, COVID's affecting all of us. So that's really, in some ways, that's a blessing, because we all really are in this together. We can all understand what's happening because it's happening to all of us. And then finally, we have the D for driven. Okay, so if you could find a higher purpose in life, whether that's through religion, for your family, work, social action that you do, whatever it is, that's going to lead to you finding more meaning in life, and you'll have less distress with your current circumstances. So you have to be careful. Don't just focus on yourself and what's going on right now, but think about what you could do to help others, and think about what lessons you can learn from COVID. How can you improve yourself and become a better, warmer, more successful person because of it? So don't just sit back and watch it go. See what you could do. Have some drive. See what you could do to grow in some area of your life, and that will lead to increased rates of post-traumatic growth. As a community, answering your second question, I think the more opportunities you could provide as a shul, I think the more your congregants will be able to do that. So, going through them again, if you have events like this where we could talk about the possible benefits, or if you have a shul WhatsApp group maybe where you point out different things that people have been able to go through or that happened to people because of COVID and try to focus on the positive, if everybody could see that together, I think people will be better off for it. The bigger part, so same thing, talk about it. Talk about, how large this world is and how many things we have gone through in our history. When we talk about, this isn't the first time we've had this week's parsha, we have the Mabul, right? So bring that up in the drasha that, there was a flood before. The flood essentially wiped out all of mankind. We're doing a whole lot better than that right now. And then connections, right? The sea. That's what shul is for. Shul is for bringing people together. Shul is for, one of the big parts of it is for people to form that connection with the rabbi, with other congregants, and to be able to grow together, both from a spiritual standpoint and also from a health standpoint. And then driven, there's no better place, for a congregation to feel drive than within the shul. I'm sure you guys have plenty of opportunities for people to get involved and to help, raise the spiritual level of the synagogue, and to, I'm sure you have many social action projects that you can work on, and to help people create that job. So I think there's plenty of opportunities both on the individual level and on the school level to create these 4 ABCDs that will allow people to get that post-traumatic growth and make it more likely that will happen.
And thinking not just about us and how we can hopefully experience this post-traumatic growth, but also about others, how others in our lives. How do we support people who are going through, who are experiencing stress and anxiety and depression right now? Let's say, especially if they're maybe either if they're seeking professional help or if they're reluctant to do it. And generally, just how can we be better caregivers?
Sure. So I think we need to reach out to people and be there for them, but don't nudge them, just, support them. I think it's important. This was, I think, the first question we spoke about it. Second question, if you recognize that somebody needs help, you could gently suggest it to them, but if they don't want to go get help, just be there for them. And there's not necessarily a right thing to say or a right thing to do, but just knowing that you're there could provide tremendous relief for the person. There's a study that I like to quote a lot that found that if you send 8 postcards a year, this is an old study before, everyone had cell phones and before there was social media, but if you send 8 postcards a year to somebody, someone that's, very depressed or very anxious, so they actually get the same benefit as what's called usual care. So if they're seeing a psychiatrist and psychologist, that's as effective as somebody reaching out to them and showing they care, sending these 8 postcards a year. And so really just telling someone, I'm thinking about you, I care about you, it could have a tremendous impact to help support them. Also, use your skills to help people. If you have money, there's people I think that, are going through hard times right now, help people financially. Think about what it is that people need. And without them asking, reach out and try to help them with it. But also respect their boundaries. Again, if they don't want something, let them know you're there for them, but don't push something that you think they need if they're saying they don't need it. One of the things that we've definitely seen in a lot of communities throughout this is programs with kids calling older individuals to check on them, especially within nursing homes. And I think that's really beautiful. And I think it definitely teaches chesed to the kids, and it decreases loneliness for the people that are being called. But sometimes I wonder if maybe a better approach would be the opposite. So kids are, already doing a lot of things. They're very engaged. They have a lot of meaning in their life. Sometimes with older people, you lose some of that connection you have with family members. Time gets a little bit quieter as you're not taking care of the family anymore. Maybe you've retired from work. You don't have as much on your plate. I wonder if it might be more helpful to have the older people reach out to the younger people, whether to teach them skills that they have, read them stories, tutor them, give them advice on careers or family. I think that may be more helpful in some ways, because that gives, a little bit more purpose and meaning to the person giving it, and also could be really helpful for the younger generations. And so, I would love to see the community get behind a program that's going the opposite route and trying to get, people, whether it's in nursing homes or people that have more time on their hands at home, to give back to the younger generation even. and help them with what they already know and what their talents are.
Definitely some great ideas, and I'm already thinking of programs for the shul that we can do like that. So someone sent in I think an important question about some of the coping strategies that you mentioned. So they wrote that sometimes someone experiencing sadness, anxiety, or stress will have more trouble than normal engaging in some of the coping strategies that you discussed. For instance, eating or sleeping well could be difficult for them. So how does someone struggling to maintain these positive habits still get on track?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so it's all of them together. If you're struggling in one area, so that does not mean that you're not going to be able to get back on track. With sleep and with meals, so if you're struggling, if all of a sudden biological changes are happening in your body, so I can't just tell you go to sleep, eat meals, and you're going to be great. It doesn't work like that. At a certain point, your body is not letting you do what it should be doing. So when I recommend, eating 3 meals, I mean scheduling the time into your day to eat 3 meals. Sit down, have a nibble, have something. Make sure you're keeping on that routine. With sleep, make sure you're having the same bedtime every night. Even if you don't sleep, get out of bed the next morning so that you have a routine. The way sleep often gets impaired is because you have a bad night of sleep, and you sleep in the next day, or you take a nap, you have caffeine during the day, and then all of a sudden you get into this bad cycle where you're keeping yourself up at night because of what you did during the day because of the previous night. So it's important not to get into those cycles. That doesn't mean you could just break it. When multiple of these things are breaking down and you're not able to control it, so that's certainly the time that you might want to seek outside help. And again, whether that's a therapist helping you with these coping techniques, or whether that's a short-term medication that can help you relax enough so that you could get back on track before things get worse. Typically, we see, first the sleep goes, then the appetite goes, then you're worried all the time. It's, one after another. It's a bad cascade. So once a few of these things are happening, once a few of these physical symptoms and the cognitive symptoms, emotional symptoms, behavioral symptoms are occurring, then it's probably time to get help before things get worse.
Okay, so if no one else has any questions, I'm going to hand things over to Noam, so he can tell us a little bit about some of the other programs that Refuat HaNefesh are offering. So Noam, I'll hand things over to you. I think.
All right, thank you so much. So one of the things that Dr. Mintz just spoke about a number of times was the idea of connection and the importance of that as a coping mechanism and something that the shul could provide. And when we were thinking as an organization, what was something that we could try to provide to help people experiencing various kinds of stress, anxiety, sadness, etc., related to the COVID pandemic, we realized that we had an opportunity using a large network to try and create some opportunities for those connections, and specifically around a focus area that's related to some of the causes of stress. Obviously, the positive steps that Dr. Min spoke about are very important. Having a designated place where it feels okay to talk about some of the things that you're struggling with is also very important. So we have coming up 4 different support groups online that we're offering free of charge to the first 10 people who sign up for any of those 4 support groups. They're capped at 10 specifically so that they really can be a place where that connection takes place, where people get a chance to articulate what's going on, how they're feeling. And all 4 of them are facilitated by experienced group leaders. These aren't therapy groups or anything of the kind. They're really peer support groups, but they are facilitated by somebody who has experience helping groups like that succeed. So if I'm able to share screen now, and is it set so I can?
Yes, it is.
Okay, So we have here, okay. So here's just a flyer, which I've sent to Rabbi Levitt, and he can send out again to the community about the 4 different groups that we're offering. And you can see that they all begin in the beginning of November in just a couple of weeks. One of them is we try to identify some of the areas that are causing some of these difficulties that many of us, myself included, are certainly experiencing. Obviously, these aren't all of the causes and all of the things that everyone's experiencing, but they seemed grouped together to be ones that were relevant to a number of people. So the first 2 of them are for people who are experiencing difficulties related to isolation and loneliness. We know that so many of the things are making it more difficult for people to connect. People aren't able to travel as much. Many people went through the Chagim without being able to have the same family over or to visit the family that they normally would have visited. People have, transitioned to working from home. People have had much less opportunity to go to shul and to interact with people there. Many of the normal ways in which we were used to having those social interactions have broken down for people. So isolation and loneliness, and this is for 2 different groups. One of them is for those 55 and older, and one is for younger adults, 18 and older. Of course, unfortunately, many people around the world have experienced grief and loss at this time. And one of the things that some people have experienced is not being able to grieve in the normal process. Unfortunately, as I'm sure everyone is here has seen a Zoom funeral over the last number of months. I know that I have. And as sad as having to go to a Zoom bris that I wasn't able to attend and really wanted to attend, the difficulties in a Zoom funeral for somebody who's experiencing loss or not being able to have people actually coming to the house for Shiva or things like that disrupted for some people the normal grieving process. So that's the 3rd group for those experiencing grief and loss. Which doesn't have to be for people who necessarily lost somebody to COVID, but again, for anyone who experienced grief and loss at this time and is having a particularly difficult time, as many are because of the situation. And the 4th group for parents of children with special needs, many of whom are feeling impacted by the difficulties of the pandemic, whether it's disruption in schooling and services, whether it's the difficulties that their children are having above and beyond what many others are having, coping with some of the things that we all have to do because of the pandemic. So these support groups are all starting within the next couple of weeks, and I'm just going to put in the chat a link to a form which people can go to sign up for any one of these support groups. Rabbi Levitt has I'm sorry, I sent it just to you. I'll send it again. Okay, there we go. So you can copy that link and go to that form, or just click on it and go to that form if you're interested in signing up. Rabbi Levitt also has it and can send it out to people as well. And we really hope that these are going to be helpful to people. And if you know of somebody who you think, Dr. Mintz was talking before about recommending to people that they get some support. If you know of somebody that you think might benefit from it, you certainly are more than welcome to pass it along to them as well. Hopefully all of us working together and being part of a community and having a supportive congregation and a supportive rabbi are going to, find ways to grow and come out the other end of this pandemic experience strong and healthy. And the main thing is to really feel comfortable bringing that up to people, talking to people, looking for support, and doing the things that you need to do for yourself to help yourself be strong, and not feel for any reason that that these kinds of issues are things which you have to cope with in silence. So thank you again for welcoming us into your congregation, and we hope to continue to collaborate again in the future. If anyone has any questions about the programs or anything else, you can feel free to ask now as well.
So thank you so much again, Dr. Mintz and Noam, for speaking with us.